Kevin, speaking of around the world, and something that you said very early here in your introduction is that Lincoln's foreign policy was only partly Lincoln's, it's Seward's foreign policy to administer. So I want to talk about Lincoln versus Seward for a little while, because I don't think we can understand Lincoln's foreign policy without doing it. First, what was the source of Seward's foreign policy competence? Where's his? Why would he be, other than patronage? Why would he be the Secretary of State?
Right. Well, for starters, he had traveled a great deal more than Lincoln did. Lincoln was relatively provincial. He had never traveled overseas. He spoke no foreign languages. He had no friends in Europe. He spoke a little bit of German that he taught himself to kind of win votes in Illinois. So that was about it for Lincoln. Seward had made several trips to Europe, to both Britain and France. In 1833, he went to Europe with his father as a younger man and kind of toured battlefields and that sort of thing. He went back in 1859 and visited some similar places. So he had seen firsthand some of the Europe, and also how Europe was changing over this period of time by going back a couple of different times. He also had experience in foreign affairs. I think he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when he was a senator in the years before the Civil War, and so he was a worldly person, and he knew a great deal about foreign affairs. But he was also he could be vain and he could be impetuous. And there's one of my favorite stories about Seward is he was the kind of guy that when he was walking down the street, one of his biographers said this, he would tip his hat to people who he thought might recognize him. He would kind of this is you know the type, right? Yeah. I mean, that's Seward. So Lincoln told Seward pretty early on. They were, of course, we all know the story of the 1860 election and how they were rivals for the nomination, and Lincoln ultimately won. So Seward had some bitterness going in, and Lincoln brought him into the cabinet, of course, as we know. And he told Seward that I'm gonna need your expertise in foreign affairs. Now, that was partly true and partly Lincoln's natural humility, because he would say things like that all the time. He would say, I know nothing about. He said, I know nothing about diplomacy. He also said, I know nothing about the Navy, for instance, and he had a patent on a device for lifting vessels, and so he knew an awful lot about the Navy and ships. So he could be humble too. But I think the defining moment, and the moment that I center on in this chapter, is April 1st, 1861. Seward, the backdrop to this is Spain has re-annexed Santo Domingo in the Caribbean. And so it's a foreign policy crisis, just as the United States is falling apart.
Even before Fort Sumter.
Right, yeah. And so and they have to deal with this, and Seward writes to Lincoln a memo. It's known as the April Fool's Memo, and he says we should demand explanations from these various powers, from Spain, and he adds France also. And he says, and if not, we should declare war against them. Lincoln considered this, and he took some of Seward's advice, by the way. There was a number of things that Seward suggested, but he ultimately said, no, we're not going to do that. And Seward, and the most kind of egregious thing in this is Seward, in this kind of backhanded way, says, and if you're not capable of doing it, President Lincoln, I'm happy to take it on. And Lincoln has this great response, and he says, if this needs to be done, I'll be the one who will do it. And so he kind of put Seward in his place early on. But I think what's interesting, we know about the kind of the conflict between Lincoln and Seward, but they were also similar in some ways. They had both been members of the Whig Party before they were Republicans. And I saw in your book that you had been, Gabor Bort was a mentor or a professor of yours, and he's done a great book about Lincoln's economic views and Lincoln's Whig economic views and what he believed. And both Lincoln and Seward, while they had differences in what they emphasized in their public speeches, they both kind of subscribed early on to this Whig view of this Whig economic view, and they both, although Lincoln wasn't a territorial expansionist, and in some ways they kind of had a similar views about economic expansion, I think, if you look at it. And so by the end of Lincoln's presidency, they had come to work together very well. They were in lockstep on a lot of issues, specifically on Mexican and French policy. And one Seward biographer compares the relationship. He said, the relationship is like each other's sober second thought, which I thought was a really nice phrase. It's almost like a husband and wife relationship in a good marriage, where sometimes the husband is right, sometimes the wife is right, and together they kind of argued a little bit, but they made good decisions.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, ultimately that served Lincolnian diplomacy pretty well.
Well, one of the things you're talking about Lincolnian diplomacy is the Whiggish version of it, approach to it is Seward, and you say this, you quote Seward when he says that the real international prize is the commerce of the world, which is the empire of the world. And is this a unique kind of American empire that might be starting with Seward's foreign policy, and definitely with Lincoln's foreign policy? We don't necessarily want to be an empire like the other empires, gobbling up territory, although we might get into that at some point. But we do have something that could be considered imperial pretensions, as we're going to project our commercial influence.
Right.
Who we are is going to take over your country. Right. How we do business, our commerce are they really starting to sort of project power even during the Civil War, project influence through commerce?
Yeah, it's dangerous always to kind of to generalize, but I think one kind of concept that I think is useful is Walter Russell Mead, the great scholar of foreign affairs, has divided the types of foreign policy into in one of his books, Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, Jacksonian. He's kind of looked at it like this, and I think Lincoln and Seward's foreign policies were essentially Hamiltonian in that they were less interested in wars of conquest and more interested in economic development, which I think is something that Professor Borak brings out really well in his work and later. So yes, I think they were, and Lincoln talked about it less than Seward did, but there are a couple of little passages if you look through the collected works carefully, where Lincoln will say things like, I think removing a snag in the Mississippi is more or less the same as defending our commerce on the high seas. And so, I think those kind of statements are revealing, and I think Lincoln did essentially have kind of a Whiggish view toward international commerce. And the Whigs, by the way, were looking at Asian export markets, 150 years before our own pivot to Asia, which we talk about today. So, and they were big on the Navy and Asia and that sort of thing.
Jared, I have a lot of questions for you.
Okay.
But the folks at home are really digging your your topic, and I'm getting a lot of questions from the folks at home. So I'm going to continue to share questions that have come in from the internet. And this one isn't signed, but as Mr. Peatman says that Lincoln's full intention of the Gettysburg Address was not realized until the Civil War centennial. Is there a particular speech or person from that event that he feels most captures that moment? What are some of the biggest hijackings of the speech? And I guess this question I'm thinking of the Civil War centennial, but
sure.
Overall, are there major hijackings?
Yeah, of course, of course. So let me answer the Civil War centennial question first, maybe, and then think about hijackings, because that's a fun topic. Mm-hmm. I argue in the book, which obviously you've read, that's great, that Lincoln intended the Gettysburg Address to be his most eloquent thought or explanation that the only way a democracy could persist was by placing equality at its core. Mm-hmm. He thought if we just had an end to the Civil War with slavery intact, that we'd be back at each other's throats within 10 years. On the other hand, if we ended the war without providing some measure of equality for freed African Americans, that we'd have civil unrest over the coming years as well. And that the only way the nation could really move forward was by placing equality at its core. Now, over the next 99 years, it's kind of a fun number, the next 99 years, I argue that when people talked about the Gettysburg Address, they talked about it for one of those three reasons. They said, oh, isn't this eloquent? Isn't it a beautiful speech? Or they said, doesn't it say great things about democracy? Or they said, in a few minority cases, they said, doesn't it say great things about equality? But almost never did they put those three things together It's not until 1963 that you start to see in this country, when people talk about the speech, they talk about the interconnection of equality and democracy. So what's the greatest example of that? The question you asked? I think it's two speeches in 1963. One by Lyndon Johnson, delivered at Gettysburg on Memorial Day, and one by Dean Rusk, delivered also at Gettysburg just a couple days before the 100th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And in both cases, what they talk about essentially is the fact that if we want to win the Cold War, which we're in the middle of at that point, then we have to win the civil rights movement at home first. Because until we do that, we can't really be a legitimate player on the world stage. Rusk and Johnson both talk about the fact that the civil discord at home is costing us allies abroad. It's making us look bad. And, by the way, it's not right. You know, it's not right that our nation hasn't lived up to the promises originally from the Declaration, but then reiterated by Abraham Lincoln 100 years earlier. That's really a change from 1962. If you look at the rhetoric in 1962, people are mostly concerned about the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis has just happened. The wall in Berlin has just gone up. They're focused on the Cold War. But in 1963, as civil rights events become primary in this country, people's thinking starts to shift about how we interpret that speech and what we as a nation need to be going forward. So that's the answer to the 1963 question. Some of the hijackings of the speech over time, there have been some fascinating comments. Kevin, because you talk about William Seward, one of my favorite comes from a woman named Rutherford, who was writing in the very early 1900s, and she's sort of a lost cause devotee in the South, and she says, she's slamming Lincoln, and she says, everybody praises Lincoln for writing the Gettysburg Address, and we all know that it was actually written by William Seward anyway. So there are a lot of these sort of hijackings of what Lincoln was intending to do along the way. You know, I think this notion that Lincoln wasn't wanted at Gettysburg or that people didn't applaud him, those are sort of hijackings of the meaning as well. And let me weigh in on something else. I heard some discussion in the store beforehand about some of the recent movies on Lincoln, and I heard a discussion about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. So let me offer a comment on that.
He was on the show.
And I'm going to praise him. I think he has constructed the most accurate Gettysburg Address scene of any Hollywood movie out there. So it's sort of the antithesis of a hijacking in that sense. Now, the rest of the movie, I found it amusing, maybe not quite as accurate. But the Gettysburg Address scene, sadly, I think is the most accurate of all the Hollywood movies that are out there. So nice job on that one. But yeah, there have been, hijackings galore over the years, and people rewriting the speech over the years. And for a variety of purposes, some really meaningful purposes. People rewriting the speech during the Civil Rights Movement to talk about what would Lincoln say in the 1960s. On the other hand, people rewriting the speech to talk about sports. Calling on different teams, the Boston Red Sox, to increase devotion to actually win the World Series. Things like that.